2,000 years ago, a Roman general sat in a tent on the edge of conquered country and wrote a book. It was calm. It was elegant. It was brilliant. It was also the testimony of the man who had just broken the independence of an entire world. Written to make himself a hero back in Rome. For 20 centuries. More of what we picture when we think of the Gauls has come from those pages than from any other place. From the words of their conqueror. There were a million other voices. People who built towns, forged iron, measured time, watched the heavens, and worshipped in quiet groves long before Rome ever learned their name. They left no book of their own. The man who beat them wrote it for them. Tonight, we hand that book back. Lower the lights. Let your breathing slow. Let the Roman voice fade. And listen, for once, to the people on the far side of the page. Chapter 1. The Victor's Manuscript. The book still exists. You can hold a copy of it today. In libraries. In classrooms. In the bags of students learning Latin for the first time. It is short. It is clear. By almost any measure, it is one of the finest pieces of prose the ancient world produced. Its title is The Commentaries on the Gallic War, and its author was Gaius Julius Caesar. He wrote it on campaign, by lamplight, in a tent at the edge of conquered country, with the noise of an army settling for the night just beyond the canvas. By day, he commanded legions. By that same lamp, he became something else, an author, shaping the events of the day into clean and confident sentences. The result would outlive the tent, and the army, and the empire that grew out of it. School children would still be translating those sentences 2,000 years later, learning their Latin from the prose of the man who wrote it. Few books have ever travelled so far, or carried so much. For more than 2,000 years, this single book has shaped how we remember an entire people. When we call the Gauls to mind, we tend to see them through Caesar's eyes. When we describe them, we often borrow Caesar's words. More of what we believe about them traces back to these pages than to any other source we have. That should give us pause. Caesar was not a historian. He was not a traveller writing out of curiosity, or a scholar trying to understand a foreign people. He was a general, the commander of the armies that invaded Gaul, burned its fields, stormed its strongholds, and beat its peoples one by one. The book we have is not a record kept by the Gauls. It is the memoir of the man who conquered them. Imagine, for a moment, that everything later generations knew about your country, your ancestors, your gods and your laws and your dead, came almost entirely from the private account of the foreign general who had crushed it, written in his language, shaped by his purposes, built, from the first sentence to the last, to make him look like a hero. That is the situation we are in with the Gauls. To see why it matters, you have to know the man holding the pen. When Caesar marched into Gaul in the year 58 BC, he was not yet the most famous Roman who ever lived. He was a politician in trouble, ambitious far beyond his rank, and buried in debt so deep it would have ruined almost anyone else. In Rome, glory and money came from war, and Caesar needed both. A long, successful campaign on the frontier could make him rich. It could make him a legend. It could give him an army loyal to him alone. Gaul was his opportunity, and the book he wrote about it was part of the plan. While the war was being fought, word flowed back to the city. Caesar understood, better than almost anyone of his age, that a battle won far away means little if the people at home do not hear about it in the right way. The commentaries told the story as he wanted it told. They explained why each campaign had been necessary. They presented every act of conquest as an answer to some threat. some betrayal, some danger that had supposedly left him no choice. They kept his name alive in Rome, while his body was 1,000 miles to the north. There is a small detail in how he wrote it that tells you almost everything. Caesar did not write about himself as I. He wrote about himself in the third person, as Caesar. Caesar advanced. Caesar decided. Caesar showed mercy. The effect is quiet, and it is powerful. It makes the story feel calm, factual, almost neutral, as though it were being set down by some impartial witness rather than by the very man whose future hung on every word. It reads like the plain truth, and that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Within its pages are pitched battles and desperate sieges, midnight escapes and mass surrenders, whole peoples swept away in a single sentence. It is, in places, a thrilling book. That is part of its power, and part of the problem. A story told this well is a story you slowly stop questioning. When this book tells us, then, that the Gauls were fickle, ruled by their moods, unable to keep their word, given to sudden panics and just as sudden rages, there is one simple question worth asking. Who gains from that portrait? A man bent on conquest has every reason to make the conquered look like they needed conquering. A people painted as wild and unstable are a people who can be ruled for their own good. A war against treacherous savages is easy to justify. A war against an ordered, intelligent society is a harder thing to explain. Caesar was not only describing the Gauls, he was building a case, and the jury sat back home in Rome. The cruelest part is that the Gauls could not answer him. They left no history of their own, not because they were unable to, but because they chose not to. They had a learned class, men who spent as long as 20 years in training, who carried the law and the lineage and the poetry and the sacred knowledge of their people inside their own minds. We will meet them properly before long. They had decided, deliberately, that the most important things should live in memory and pass from voice to voice, never set down on a page, among themselves, for centuries. It worked. When their way of life ended, their side of the story ended with it. The voices fell silent, and the only voice left speaking, loud and clear and beautifully written, belonged to the man who had silenced them. We are not entirely at his mercy. That is what makes this story possible to tell at all. Caesar was not the first outsider to study the Gauls. Long before the legions came, Greek travelers and writers had visited the Celtic lands, traded there, and tried to describe what they saw. One of them, a Greek philosopher named Posidonius, journeyed among the Gauls roughly 2 generations before the war and wrote down his observations. His own work is lost to us now, but other ancient writers read it while it survived and preserved pieces of it, through Diodorus Siculus, through the geographer Strabo, through scattered fragments. We can still catch glimpses of the Gauls as a curious foreigner saw them, rather than as a man at war needed them to appear. Those accounts carry their own prejudices, their own hunger for the strange. They were not, at least, written to justify a war. There is also a witness that cannot bend itself to flatter anyone: the earth. The Gauls left almost no words, but they left an enormous amount of everything else. Coins, struck with their own designs, in gold and silver and bronze, swords and shields and finely made armor, jewelry of astonishing craft, the foundations of their towns, the great walled settlements the Romans themselves called oppida, some larger and better ordered than Caesar's account would lead you to expect, and their dead, buried with the things they loved most, lying quietly for archaeologists to find 100 generations later. A coin does not care about a Roman's career. A grave does not arrange itself to fit a Roman story. When the spade lifts an object made by Gaulish hands out of the soil, we are touching something that reaches us straight from them, with no Roman standing in between. That is the work ahead of us. Tonight, and in the hours to come, we will read his book against the grain. We will take it seriously, because it is the testimony of an eyewitness, and a sharp one. But we will weigh it the way you weigh the testimony of a man, with everything to gain. We will set his words beside the travellers who came before him, and beside the silent evidence waiting in the ground. And slowly, carefully, try to recover the people underneath. We will not hear them perfectly. The quiet they left behind is real, and some of it can never be filled. There will be moments when the most truthful thing to say is simply that we do not know. That is the price of telling this story without inventing it. The first thing to recover is the simplest, and the one everything else rests upon. Not the war, not Caesar, the land itself, as it was in the long quiet years before any of this began. Green and wide and full of people. A country of slow rivers and deep forests. Of fields turning gold in the late summer. Of walled towns standing on their hills and the smoke of 1,000 hearths rising at dusk. A living, breathing country, going about its days, with no idea at all of what was coming for it out of the south. Chapter 2. A land called Gaul. There is a sentence almost every student of Latin has met. It is the first line of Caesar's book, and one of the most famous openings ever written. All Gaul, it says, is divided into 3 parts. With those words, Caesar drew his map. In his telling, the land held 3 broad groups. The Belgae in the north, the Aquitani in the southwest, down toward the mountains we now call the Pyrenees, and in the great middle, the people who, in their own tongue, called themselves Celts, and whom the Romans called Gauls. It is a tidy picture. Like much of the book, it is a little too tidy. Start with the land, because the land explains nearly everything that follows. The heart of it had the shape of modern France, though Gaul was larger still. It spilled over into what is now Belgium and Switzerland, and the western edge of Germany along the broad river Rhine. To the south, it touched the warm Mediterranean. To the west, the cold grey Atlantic. To the southeast rose the Alps, and beyond them, Italy and Rome. Within those borders lay one of the richest stretches of country in the ancient world. To a traveller coming up from the dry and sunlit south, it must have seemed another country entirely, green and dripping, its forests darker and its rivers wider and its winters colder than anything they had ever known. It was a land of rivers, the Rhone, carrying trade up from the south, the Loire and the Seine, winding slow through the green interior, the Garonne in the southwest. The soil ran deep and good. The forests were thick with timber and game. There were broad fields of grain, herds of cattle and pigs, mines of iron and silver and gold. This was a prize, and Rome knew it. Life there followed the turning of the year. In spring, the heavy ploughs broke the dark soil, and the cattle were driven out to graze. In summer, the grain ripened across the wide fields, and the herds grew fat. In autumn came the harvest and the slaughter, and the laying in of stores against the cold. And the smoke of the feasts hung low over the hills. In winter, the people drew close around their fires in the timber halls, and the bards sang, and the old stories were told once more. For most of those who lived it, this was an ordinary life, neither golden nor savage. It was simply home. The most important thing to understand about Gaul is that it was never one country, and never one people. Caesar's 3 parts were a simplification, useful for a Roman reader who liked the map, made simple. The truth on the ground was far more crowded. Gaul was a patchwork of many separate peoples. Modern writers often call them tribes, though that word can make them sound smaller and simpler than they were. Each had its own name, its own territory, with borders recognized and defended, its own leaders, its own gods, its own customs, and its own long history of friendship and feud with the peoples next door. A few of these names will return again and again in the hours ahead, so they are worth meeting now. There were the Aedui, in the centre of Gaul, a wealthy and powerful people, long friends of Rome, honoured with a special standing and called brothers and kinsmen, a friendship that would matter enormously when the war came. There were the Arverni, to the west. In the highlands we now call the Auvergne, proud and strong. These peoples were not sealed away from one another in silent forests. They traded, they quarrelled, they made treaties and broke them, and gathered in councils. The stronger drew the weaker around them as allies and dependents, and the balance of power shifted from one generation to the next, much as it did among the kingdoms and city-states of the Mediterranean. Yet for all that division, a single thread ran through nearly all of them. They spoke closely related forms of the same language, a Celtic tongue, so that a traveller crossing Gaul could likely make himself understood from one people to the next. They shared broad customs, similar gods under different names, and the same class of priests, who moved freely across every border. In its politics, Gaul was many. In its culture, it was something closer to one, a civilization divided into nations. Then, not a scattering of strangers, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else in the story. It is the difference between a people who might one day imagine standing together and a loose crowd of unconnected tribes. There lies the deep tragedy waiting at the center of everything. A land of separate nations can be conquered one piece at a time, where the Gauls saw old rivals and older grudges. A patient enemy would one day see an open door. Gaul was also far more connected to the wider Mediterranean than the word barbarian suggests. Down on the southern coast stood a city called Massalia, which we know today as Marseille, founded by Greek settlers around 600 BC. For centuries it had served as a doorway between the Mediterranean and the Gaulish interior. Out of Gaul came metals, grain, salted meats, and slaves. Into Gaul came the luxuries of the south, and above all, wine. The Gauls, it seems, loved wine. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus, drawing on older accounts, described how eagerly they bought it from Italian merchants, claiming some would give a great deal to get it. His figures may well be exaggerated, as ancient writers describing foreign appetites so often were. The wine itself is not in doubt. Archaeologists have lifted the remains of countless Italian wine jars from Gaulish sites. The trade was real, and it was enormous. Their coins tell the same story. The Gauls struck their own money, in gold and silver and bronze, at first copying the elegant coins of the Greeks, and then, over generations, reshaping those borrowed designs into something wholly their own, bold and abstract and unmistakably Gaulish. A people who mint their own coinage are a people with trade to conduct, with value to measure, with rulers who wish to leave a mark behind them. The goods of that trade did not flow into huts. They flowed into towns. The Gauls built large fortified settlements, the Romans themselves called oppida, not cities in the marble sense Rome would have recognized, but real towns, some spreading across many acres behind enormous ramparts. The Gauls had a distinctive way of raising those walls, lacing together timber and earth and stone into a structure so solid it could blunt a battering ram and resist fire at the same time. Caesar wrote of it with a soldier's grudging respect, because he was the one who would have to take such places by siege. Inside, the greatest of them lived smiths working iron and bronze and gold, merchants weighing out coins, the households of the powerful. Set the picture another way. Then, a broad and fertile land, threaded with slow rivers, dotted with walled towns, home to several million people, though the estimates of that number vary widely, and every one deserves caution. A country of many proud peoples, tied by trade to the heart of the Mediterranean, sharing one tongue and one culture, and divided among themselves in ways a patient enemy could one day use. That is the land. To understand the people who lived on it, we have to come closer still. In past, the ramparts and the gates. Into the halls, where power was held, and the bonds that held it together, the Gauls, for all that Caesar would call them wild, lived by a code of rank and law and obligation as ordered, in its own way, as Rome itself. Chapter 3. How a Gaulish world worked. Inside any Gaulish people, the first thing you would notice is that almost everything rested on rank. This was not a society of equals. Few ancient societies were Caesar, who looked closely at how the Gauls arranged themselves. We found really only two classes that counted for much. There were the men of learning, the priests and keepers of sacred knowledge, whom we will come to know well before long. There were the warrior nobles, the men he called knights, who fought and led and held the land. Below them stood almost everyone else. The common people, in Caesar's description, had little power of their own. Many lived close to dependency, weighed down by debt, by heavy obligation, or simply by the pressure of the strong, so they did what people in that position have always done. They attached themselves to someone more powerful, in exchange for protection. This was the heart of how a Gaulish society held together. A powerful noble measured his strength not only in land or in gold, but in people, in the number of followers who depended on him, who owed him service, who would ride to war the moment he called. Power was personal. You could read it in the size of the crowd at a great man's back. The follower owed support and service. The lord owed protection and reward. And that bargain, repeated across thousands of bonds, was what made a people something more than a crowd. Here is something the word barbarian would never lead you to expect. In the older days, many Gaulish peoples had been ruled by kings. By Caesar's time, many had turned away from the rule of one man, wary of letting any single person hold power for life, much as the Romans themselves, centuries before, had driven out their own kings. Among the Aedui, the chief magistrate was no king at all. He was elected and held office for a single year. They called him the Vergobret. There were strict rules around the post. The holder could not, Caesar tells us, so much as leave the borders of his people's own territory while his term lasted. Power was watched. Power was limited. Power answered to a council of leading men. In the heart of a land Rome would dismiss as wild. There were peoples holding yearly elections, binding their leaders with law, and governing themselves through councils. Not democracy as we would know it, ruled by an aristocracy, but a long way indeed from the howling chaos a Roman might imagine. These were, beyond any question, warrior societies. Honour was the currency a noble lived and died for. A Gaulish nobleman was raised to prize courage above almost everything. And the Greek writers who watched the Gauls described men who loved display, who wore bright colours and gold at the throat, who boasted of their deeds and were quick to take offence. Before a battle, a warrior might ride out before the lines and challenge any enemy bold enough to face him alone, calling out the brave deeds of his ancestors, daring his opponent to match them. When the lines finally crashed together, the Gauls fought with a fury the armies of the Mediterranean had learned to dread. Tall men, swinging long iron swords, hurling themselves forward in a charge meant to shatter an enemy by terror and weight before the real fighting had even begun. It did not always work against the cold discipline of a Roman line. For centuries, though, the very word Gaul had carried a shiver of fear through the cities of the south, and that fear had been earned in blood. There was a darker side to that honour, and an honest account cannot leave it out. Greek writers, including those drawing on the traveller Posidonius, reported that Gaulish warriors took the heads of the enemies they killed in battle and kept them as proof of their courage, the most prized of them carefully preserved and shown to guests. For a long time this was waved away as a traveller's tall tale. Then, in southern Gaul, archaeologists uncovered sanctuaries with stone niches that appear to have held human skulls, set among carved stone heads. The evidence is grim, and it is real. This was a culture that honoured the warrior completely, including the parts that are hard for us to look at. The same Greek writers who recorded that darkness recorded something gentler beside it. The Gauls were, by repeated account, remarkably hospitable. A stranger arriving at a Gaulish door, even one nobody knew, could expect to be fed and sheltered before anyone thought to ask his business. To these warrior peoples, generosity was not the opposite of strength. It was part of it. The same hand that took a head in battle would fill a guest's cup at home. And both, to the Gaulish mind, were the mark of a great man. When they were not at war, the high moments of this society gathered around the feast. The hall filled on a winter night, a long fire running down the centre, the smoke curling up into the dark of the roof, the smell of roasting meat, of wood smoke, of spilled drink. Warriors ranged along the walls in their bright checked cloaks, gold at their throats, catching the firelight, hounds underfoot, the rise and fall of boasting and laughter. The feast was far more than a meal. It was where status was displayed, where alliances were sealed, where a man proved his wealth and his generosity by the sheer abundance he set before his guests. The seating was a map of rank. The most important men took the most honoured places, and by the Greek accounts, the bravest warrior was given the finest cut of the meat. That honour could be disputed. There are reports of warriors coming to blows, even to single combat, over who deserved the champion's portion. To us, it can sound absurd. To them, it was the whole point. The food was a measure of a man's worth. Through the feast moved another kind of figure. The Gauls had poets, men, the writers of the south, called bards, who sang to the sound of stringed instruments. They sang the praises of the great, and could wound just as easily with mockery. In a society where reputation was everything, and almost nothing was written down, the man who shaped the songs held a quiet, very real power. To be praised by the bards was to live on. To be mocked by them was a kind of death. What of the women? Here we have to tread carefully, because the truth is harder to recover and far easier to romanticize. It is sometimes said the Gaulish women were the full equals of their men. The honest answer is that we do not know nearly enough to claim it, and the evidence we have is mixed. Caesar described a marriage custom in which a husband matched his wife's dowry with an equal sum of his own, the whole of it, with whatever it had earned, passing to whichever of the two outlived the other. That hints at a recognized place for women in the holding of property, which not every ancient society allowed. Other parts of his account describe men wielding great power over their households. The likeliest truth is that the position of women varied, probably better in some ways than at Rome and worse in others, and that we should resist the urge to flatten them into a simple story in either direction. For most people, of course, life was not lived in the halls at all, but out in the fields and the small farmsteads, in the daily round of grain and cattle and craft. They are the ones the sources barely mention, because the men who wrote things down cared about kings and warriors, not farmers. They were the great majority, though, and the whole proud structure of nobles and clients and feasts rested, in the end, upon their labour. So this was Gaulish society from the inside. Rank and clientage. Nobles, measured in the followers, at their backs. A people who had, in many places, set their kings aside for elected magistrates and watchful councils. A warrior culture that honoured courage and the feast and the song, with a hardness at its core we should neither hide nor exaggerate. A society with law, with politics, with order. There was one group, though, that stood above even the proud warrior nobles. They held the law and the law. They read the turning of the seasons and the will of the gods. They could halt a war with a single word, and they trained for 20 years before their learning was complete. And they were the ones who chose, on purpose, never to set a word of it down. Chapter 4. The Keepers of Knowledge. Above the warriors, above even the proud nobles, stood a smaller group, whose power was of an altogether different kind. They owned no great estates. They led no followers into battle. Yet in their own quiet way, they may have been the most powerful people in Gaul. The Greeks and Romans borrowed a word for them from the Gauls themselves. They called them the Druids. The word today tends to summon a robed figure in a misty wood. Half wizard, half priest. That picture is mostly invention, built up over many centuries, and it is worth setting gently aside. The real Druids of Gaul were something both less mysterious and far more impressive. They were the educated class, among a people who wrote almost nothing down. They were the living memory of everything that mattered. To call them priests is true, but it is only a sliver of the truth. They did preside over the worship of the gods and over the great sacrifices. They were also the judges. When one man wronged another, when a quarrel turned to blood, when two whole peoples stood on the edge of war, it was the Druids who heard the case and gave the ruling. They were the keepers of the law, holding the customs and judgments of generations in memory. They were the teachers, to whom the sons of the noble families were sent. They were the healers, the keepers of lineage, the watchers of the sky, and the nearest thing the Gauls had to philosophers. In a single body of people they had gathered their church, their university, their high court, and their school, and they carried all of it in their heads. Becoming a Druid was the work of a lifetime, or close to it. By Caesar's account, the training could run as long as 20 years, and almost all of it was learned by heart. The student took in a vast body of verse, the sacred teaching of the order, line after line after line, holding the law and the doctrine of the gods in memory alone. None of it was written. The Druids could write, in their everyday affairs. Caesar says, they used the Greek alphabet, their sacred knowledge, though they refused to put onto a page, and they did so on purpose. They did not want it scattered carelessly among people who had not earned it more deeply. They believed that leaning on the written word would weaken the memory. Why train the mind to hold a thing? The reasoning went, if the page will hold it for you. Those 20 years must have been a strange and total immersion. A young man of good family, given over to the order, spending the better part of his youth among the learned. in groves and quiet places, committing to memory a sea of verse no one was permitted to write down. Season after season, the same lines repeated, corrected, deepened, until the knowledge was no longer on any page, but woven into the man himself. By the end, he was a living book. One of the few in which the law and the faith and the wisdom of his people were kept. There were many such men, and together they formed the library of a whole civilization. A library with no shelves and no pages, held in the minds of the living. It is a remarkable idea, and among themselves it worked. For centuries, the knowledge passed cleanly from teacher to student, mind to mind, without a single book. There was a terrible risk buried in it, though, and history would one day come to collect. A library can survive the death of its librarians. A knowledge that lives only in trained minds dies when those minds are gone. We will see, before this is over, exactly what that meant. The power of the Druids did not stop at the edge of any one people's land. This is among the most striking things about them. In a Gaul split into dozens of rival nations, the Druids were a single order that crossed every border. A Druid of one people was honoured among all of them. Once a year, Caesar tells us, the Druids of all Gaul gathered at a consecrated place in the territory of the Carnutes, whose lands lay near the centre of the country. There they sat in judgment. People came from across Gaul to lay their disputes before them, and the rulings they handed down were obeyed. In a land with no single king, no single government, no single capital, here was one institution the whole of Gaul recognized. The Druids were, in their quiet way, the nearest thing the Gauls had to a nation. At the head of the order stood a single chief Druid, who held the highest authority for as long as he lived. When he died, the most worthy took his place, and if more than one had a claim, the matter could be settled by a vote, or now and then by force of arms. They held a weapon stronger than any sword. If a man refused to accept a Druid's judgment, they could forbid him the sacrifices. To us, that sounds mild. To a Gaul, it was close to a sentence of living death. A person cut off from the sacrifices was treated as unclean, as cursed. People shunned him. They would not come near him, would not speak with him, would not trade with him, for fear his misfortune might somehow reach them too. He lost his place among his own, with no prisons and no police. This was how the Druids enforced the law. A single word could make a man an outcast in his own land. At the heart of their teaching lay a belief the Greeks and Romans found fascinating, and one that helps explain the famous Gaulish fearlessness in battle. The Druids taught, by Caesar's account and others, that the soul does not die. When the body perished, the soul passed on into another. Death was not an ending but a doorway. Men who truly believe the soul lives on do not fear the grave the way other men do. Some ancient writers thought this teaching was the very reason the Gauls could throw themselves into battle with such reckless courage. Whether or not that is the whole of it, the belief itself is well attested. To the Druids, the line between this life and the next was thin, and the dead were not entirely gone. They were students of the heavens as well. The ancient writers credited them with knowledge of the stars and their movements, of the size of the earth, and of the measuring of time. A remarkable Gaulish calendar, cut into bronze and surviving from the era of Roman Gaul, tracks the months and the years and marks the favourable days, apart from the unfavourable. It reflects an older tradition of careful timekeeping, and it quietly rebukes anyone who imagined these people as simple. The Gauls measured time with care, because the right day mattered to them, for a gathering, for a festival, for an offering to the gods. They were healers too, versed in the properties of plants, and one image of that has survived more vividly than almost any other. The Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, described the reverence the Druids held for the mistletoe that grew rarely upon the sacred oak. On a chosen day, he wrote, a Druid in white robes would climb the tree and cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle, and it would be caught in a white cloak spread out below, and 2 white bulls would be offered, and the plant kept as a remedy. How much of that scene Pliny got right, we cannot say. The heart of it rings true, though. A people who found the divine in a tree, and in a sprig of green growing high in the bare winter branches, and who read meaning into the living things all around them. To Roman eyes, there was a darker side to the Druids too, and we will weigh it with care when we come to the Gaulish gods. For now, hold only this. Rome did not merely look down on the Druids. Rome came to fear them, and in time moved against them by law. You do not trouble to outlaw a class of harmless eccentrics. You move against the people you believe are dangerous. The fury with which Rome would one day hunt the Druids out of public life is, in its own way, a measure of how much power these keepers of knowledge truly held. Here, then, is a Gaul that Caesar's case for war would rather you did not see, a people with an order of scholars trained for 20 years, a single system of law and judgment reaching across every border, with a high court that met each year at the heart of the land, with astronomers and teachers and philosophers, and a belief about the soul that steadied them in the face of death. Here, too, is the wound at the centre of it, because they wrote none of it down. Much of it is gone. We know the Druids were learned. We can barely begin to say what they actually knew. The verses they spent 20 years learning were never written, and when the order was broken, in time, those verses went quiet. What survives is the outline of a great body of knowledge, and almost none of the knowledge itself. They left us little we can hold in our hands. Their wisdom went into the ground with them, and the ground has never given it back. Chapter 5. Iron, Gold, and the Things They Made. The Druids dealt in things that could not be held. The rest of the Gauls were, to a degree that has surprised many who study them, a people of the hand. They were makers. They were engineers. Some of what they made was so good that the empire which beat them simply took it, kept it, and used it for centuries. Begin with iron. The Gauls were among the finest ironworkers of their age. No people scratching at soft metal with crude tools, but smiths who produced iron of real quality and shaped it with great skill. Their long swords, made for slashing from horseback or in the crush of a charge, were respected and feared far beyond their borders. One piece of their ironwork in particular, the Gauls, or peoples, very close to them, appear to have given to all of history. It is widely believed that mail armour, the shirt woven from thousands of small interlinked iron rings, was a Celtic invention. It is a brilliant piece of engineering. Each ring joins the rings around it, so the whole garment bends and flexes with the body while still turning the edge of a blade. The Romans met it, saw at once how good it was, and took it up for their own legions, where it would protect Roman soldiers for hundreds of years. The armour that came to stand for the Roman legionary may well have come, first, from the very people Rome conquered. Their gift was not only for war. It showed in the plain, unglamorous business of ordinary work. Among the things ancient writers and modern archaeology link to the Gauls and their neighbours is a heavy-wheeled plough, better suited than older tools to the deep, wet soils of the north. Just how much the Gauls shaped that particular tool is debated among historians, but ploughs of the kind were noticed at work in the provinces, and the idea behind them would matter for a very long time. There is the barrel, the wooden cask bound with hoops, which appears to have been a Celtic creation. It seems a small thing until you realize a barrel could store and move liquids and goods far more easily than the heavy clay jars of the Mediterranean. Whole patterns of trade would one day rest upon it. They improved the wheel and the wagon as well, a craft at which they excelled. You can hear the echo of it in the Latin language itself. A number of Roman words for wheeled vehicles were borrowed straight from Gaulish, because when the Romans wanted the best wagons and carriages, they looked north to the people who built them. Their skill with the wheel went hand in hand with their skill with the horse. The Gauls were superb riders, fitting their animals with harness and trappings, worked in bronze and finished with care. Gaulish cavalry was so prized that Roman commanders, Caesar very much among them, were glad to have them, and Gaulish horsemen would ride in Roman armies for generations. The horse stood close to the heart of this culture, a mark of wealth and of freedom, and the metalwork made to adorn it was some of the finest they ever produced. Even the small comforts of life owe them a debt. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder tells us it was the Gauls who invented soap, made from tallow and ash and used, he says, to redden and dress their hair. Roman writers also described a remarkable harvesting machine at work in the broad fields of Gaul. A cart pushed through the standing grain that stripped off the ears as it went. A mechanical reaper of a kind Europe would not see again for a very long time. There was wealth in the ground, too, and the Gauls knew how to bring it out. They mined iron and other metals on a large scale. They worked salt, no small matter in the ancient economy, using it to cure the meat of their many pigs into hams and salted pork prized well beyond their own borders. Greek and Roman writers noted the trade, and the salted meats of Gaul travelled south to feed the markets of Italy. A people who supply a foreign market are not living hand to mouth in a forest. They are producers, with a surplus to sell and the skill to make it worth buying. None of this is the work of savages. It is the work of clever, practical people, often solving the real problems of farming and trade and war better than anyone around them. They did not only make things that were useful, they made things that were beautiful. The Gauls and the wider Celtic peoples produced a style of art so distinctive that scholars recognize it at a glance. We call it the La Tène style, after the place in Switzerland where so much of it first came to light. It is a play of flowing curves and spirals, of shapes that seem to grow and twist like living vines, of faces and creatures half hidden in swirling abstract patterns. It decorated their finest swords and the scabbards that held them, their helmets, their mirrors, their jewelry, confident, sophisticated, instantly recognizable, the visual signature of a culture all its own. Above all, they loved gold, and the supreme expression of Gaulish gold was the torque, the heavy ring of twisted metal worn around the neck. The torque was far more than an ornament. It was a mark of rank and of identity, worn by warriors and nobles, sometimes worn into battle with almost nothing else beside it. There is a famous ancient statue, carved by Greek hands to mark a victory over the Gauls. That shows a fallen warrior, stripped bare, dying, wearing only the twisted torque at his throat. Even his enemies understood that the torque was the emblem of the Gaul. The goldsmiths who made these pieces worked with astonishing skill, and the best of their work can still stop a visitor in their tracks in a museum today. They loved colour as much as gold. The writers of the Mediterranean, used to plain white robes, were struck by how brightly these northern peoples dressed, in cloaks and tunics woven in vivid colours, often in stripes and checks, not unlike the tartans later ages would come to know. They wore something the Romans found almost comic at first, and then quietly sensible. They wore trousers. The word the Romans used for such garments was borrowed, like so much else, from the Celtic tongue. In the cold of the north, trousers simply made sense. And in time, even Roman soldiers, posted to the frozen frontiers, came round to the wisdom of the people they had once mocked for wearing them. All this making and trading and adorning happened. More and more. Inside towns, we have seen the great walls of the Oppida from the outside, and felt Caesar's respect for them as he readied his sieges. Consider Bibracte, the chief town of the Aedui, spread across a high hill in the centre of Gaul. Behind its ramparts ran real streets and lanes. There were quarters where smiths worked iron and bronze, where craftsmen made and sold their goods, where merchants dealt in wares from near and far. There were the grand houses of the powerful and the homes of the many who served them. Thousands could live and work in such a place. It had industry. It had trade. It had government. These were the beating hearts of Gaulish life, and their names will return. Because some of these strongholds, a hilltop called Gergovia and another called Alesia, were soon to become something other than centres of trade. Set it all beside the legend of the howling savage. Then, and the legend looks thin, a people who forged the armour Rome would come to wear. A people whose barrels and wagons helped shape the everyday life of Europe. A people who made beauty out of swirling lines and twisted gold, and filled real towns with the noise of craft and trade. The conquered, it turns out, shaped the conquerors. Long after free Gaul was gone, Romans were drinking from Gaulish barrels, fighting in Gaulish mail, rolling along the roads on wagons that carried Gaulish names. That leaves one corner of the Gaulish story still in shadow, the deepest and strangest of all, their gods, their sacred groves, and the dark water where they laid their offerings down, and the one hard question Rome would use against them more than any other, the question of what, in the end, they were willing to give. Chapter 6. Gods, Groves, and the Otherworld. Walk into a clearing among old trees, somewhere in the green heart of Gaul, where the light falls soft and broken and the air hangs still. There is no temple here, no altar of marble. The trees themselves are the temple. A sacred grove like this is as close as we can easily come to the religion of the Gauls, because their gods did not live in buildings. They lived in the land. This is the hardest part of Gaulish life to recover, and in some ways the most important. The reason we already know. The Drites, who held this knowledge, wrote none of it down, and when they were gone, most of what they believed went with them. What we have are fragments, the names of gods carved on stones, most of them from after the conquest, the accounts of Greek and Roman writers, who saw it from outside and rarely understood it, the silent evidence of the sacred places, lifted from the earth. From these scraps we can sketch an outline. We cannot read the full scripture of a single Gaulish faith, because there may never have been one. The Gauls did not worship in the tidy way a modern reader might expect, with one set of gods honoured everywhere under fixed names. Their divine landscape was vast and local. Hundreds of god names survive, and many appear in only one place. One valley, one spring. There were great gods known across wide regions, and small gods of a single hill or stream. The divine was woven into the land itself. A god could live in a particular river, a particular wood, a particular bend of dark water. A few names recur, often enough that we can speak them, even if we cannot fully explain them. There was a god the Romans tied to their own Mercury, whom Caesar said the Gauls honoured above all others as the giver of skills and the guide of travellers and trade. There was a horned god, shown sitting cross-legged with the antlers of a stag, known to us from images far more than from words. A lord of beasts and wild places. There was a god of thunder, and a goddess of horses, so beloved that even Roman cavalrymen would one day take up her worship and carry it across the empire. We know their shapes. We strain to hear their stories. The stories were in the keeping of the Druids, and the Druids are silent. Even the little we have comes to us filtered. When the Romans looked at a Gaulish god, they reached for the nearest Roman name and pinned it on, calling one god Mercury, another Mars, another Apollo, as though the Gauls had merely been worshipping the Roman gods all along under strange foreign accents. They had not. A Gaulish god, dressed in a Roman name, is still wearing a disguise. We are seeing these deities through Roman eyes, and the glass is far from clear. What we can see more plainly is where the Gauls worshipped, and how. In the older days, they raised no great temples of stone. Their holiest places were in nature. The sacred grove, a clearing set apart for the divine, springs that were holy, and lakes, and rivers, and the shadowed places where water rose out of the earth. To the Gaulish mind, water was a doorway, a meeting point between this life and the next. And into the water they made their offerings. Here, the spade confirms the ancient writers in the most vivid way. Across the Gaulish and Celtic lands, archaeologists have drawn extraordinary things from old lakes and rivers and bogs. Swords, deliberately bent so they could never be used again. Shields, helmets, jewelry, cauldrons of worked metal, treasures of real value, cast into the dark water on purpose, given to the gods and never meant to be drawn back out. A people do not drown their wealth in a lake by accident. This was devotion, and costly devotion, repeated over many generations. There were also enclosed sanctuaries, especially in the north, ringed by banks and ditches, where the people gathered to make their offerings. Those who have dug them have found the bones of sacrificed animals in great number, and the weapons taken from beaten enemies, and at some sites, human remains as well, sometimes arranged in ways that are difficult and disturbing to make sense of. These places were not gentle. They were where a warrior people met its gods, and they bore the marks of war and of death. Which brings us to the charge that has hung over the Gauls for 2,000 years. The one we promised to weigh with care. Did the Gauls sacrifice human beings? The ancient writers said they did, and said it often. Caesar described it plainly, writing that the Gauls believed the gods could be repaid for a human life only with another human life, and that the Druids oversaw these offerings. He passed on a single unforgettable image that has shaped how the Gauls have been pictured ever since, of enormous figures woven out of branches, filled with living people, and set ablaze. So the victims died in the flames as a gift to the gods. It is a horrifying picture, and 3 things are worth holding in mind before we accept it. The first is who was telling us. The man writing this was in the very middle of conquering these people, and a general who paints his enemy as a people who burn human beings alive is a general making his war look like a rescue. The horror was useful to him. The second is that Rome was, in those same years, moving to stamp out the Druids and to forbid human sacrifice across its growing empire. And a people accused of monstrous rites are far easier to govern and to crush than a people who are merely different. The third is that this most famous image, the great burning figure, reaches us only from these hostile written accounts, and never from the ground. No archaeologist has ever turned up a Gaulish giant of wicker. It lives in the words of Rome, and Rome had every reason to make the Gauls look like monsters. Is it all simply propaganda? Then that would be too easy, and not honest either. The truth, as near as we can reach it, sits in the harder middle. Ritual killing does seem to have been a real part of religious life among the Gauls and their neighbours, as it was in many ancient societies. The evidence in the ground. The human remains at certain sanctuaries. The bodies drawn from northern bogs, bearing the marks of a deliberate, ceremonial death, suggests that human lives were given to the gods, at least sometimes. We should not pretend otherwise, simply to make the Gauls easier to admire. The mass burnings and the towering figures of flame that the Roman writers described, though, almost certainly owe far more to Roman storytelling than to anything the Gauls actually did. One thing more we should not let slip past. The people so appalled by Gaulish sacrifice were the Romans. The same Rome that, in its own earlier history, had buried people alive as offerings in moments of terror. The same Rome that, in Caesar's own lifetime, filled stone arenas with roaring crowds to watch men and beasts kill one another for sport, and called it entertainment. The Gauls, who shed blood for their gods, were not facing a gentle people horrified by death. They were facing a people who had simply organized death differently, and who would happily use the Gaulish altars as one more reason to march. The line between civilized and savage was never as clean as the conquerors needed it to be. Beneath all of it lay the belief we met among the Druids, that the soul does not die, that another life waits on the far side of this one. The Gauls buried their dead with the things they would need, with food and weapons and ornaments, and the greatest among them were sent into the earth with astonishing wealth, some even with their wagons, as if for a long journey. The Greek and Roman writers recorded a detail about this faith that is almost touching in its confidence. The Gauls, they said, he was so certain that life went on beyond death that some would lend money in this life on the promise of being repaid in the next. A few, it was written, would even throw letters onto the funeral fire, messages for the dead to carry to those who had gone before. What kind of faith does that take? To write a letter to someone already dead, and trust the flames to deliver it. These were not people huddled in fear of the dark. These were people who believed, with their whole hearts, that the dark was not the end. That was Gaulish life seen from the inside. Its peoples and its ranks, its keepers of knowledge, its makers and its gods. A civilization rich and ordered, and strange and deeply human. No people lives alone. Though, to understand what was about to happen to the Gauls, we have to turn and see them from the outside, the way the rest of the ancient world saw them, and above all, the way they were seen in one particular city, a city that had once watched a Gaulish army pour through its streets and set its houses alight, and had never, ever forgotten. Chapter 7. The Terror of Rome. To the Gauls. Rome was a distant power, away to the south. Growing, sometimes troublesome, but only one force among many. To Rome, the Gauls were something else entirely. The Gauls were the oldest nightmare the city had. To understand why, we have to leave Caesar's century behind for a while and travel back more than 300 years before his war, to a day Rome would never be allowed to forget. Around the year 390 BC, by the traditional reckoning, a Gaulish army came down out of the north into Italy. They were a people the Romans called the Senones, led by a chieftain whose name comes down to us as Brennus, though that may have been a title as much as a man. Rome sent its army out to stop them at a small river called the Alesia. What happened there was less a battle than a collapse. The Roman force broke and scattered, and the road to the city lay open. The unthinkable followed. The Gauls walked into Rome. For a young and proud city, it was very nearly the end of everything. Most of the people fled. The Gauls poured through the streets, and much of the city was given to the flames. A last band of defenders held out on the steep height of the Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of Rome, while the enemy camped in the smoking ruins below. The stories the Romans later told about those days became legends, and we should treat them as legends, beautiful and uncertain. They told how the Gauls crept up the cliff of the capital one silent night, and how the sleeping defenders were saved only because the sacred geese, kept in the temple of the goddess, began to cackle in alarm and woke them just in time. They told how, in the end, Rome agreed to buy the Gauls off with a great weight of gold, and how, as the gold was being weighed out, the Romans complained that the scales had been rigged against them, and the Gaulish leader threw his heavy sword onto the weights to tip them further still, and spoke 2 words Roman memory would never release. Vae victis. Woe to the conquered. Whether the geese truly saved the capital, whether those exact words were ever spoken, we cannot know. Legends are not records. Beneath the legend, though, lies a hard and certain fact. A Gaulish army had taken Rome, burned it, and left only when it was paid to go. That fact burned itself into the soul of the city. This is the thing so easy to miss, and so important to grasp. For centuries afterward, long after Rome had grown strong and proud and dangerous, the city carried a special dread of the Gauls it carried for no one else. The memory of the burning was handed down like an inherited wound. The Romans kept a particular name in their minds for the kind of emergency a Gaulish invasion meant, a terror beyond ordinary war. Even old religious rules, it was said, would bend before it, so that men normally spared from military service could be called to arms when the Gauls were the enemy. The fear was real. It was built into their institutions. It lasted for generations. So when, much later, a Roman general spoke gravely of the Gaulish threat, he was not speaking into empty air. He was striking a nerve that ran all the way back to the smoke and the geese and the gold. Keep that in mind. It will matter enormously when we come to how Caesar sold his war. The sack of Rome was only one stroke of a far larger storm. In the centuries around that time, the Celtic peoples, of whom the Gauls were a part, were on the move across an astonishing sweep of country. They flooded into northern Italy and settled the rich valley of the River Po so thoroughly that the Romans came to call that whole region Gaul on this side of the Alps, a Gaulish land lying inside Italy itself. They pushed east and south, into the Balkans and into Greece. Around the year 279 BC, a great Celtic army, led by another leader, the Greeks remembered as Brennus, drove deep into Greece and fell upon the most sacred shrine in the Greek lands, the oracle at Delphi. The Greeks turned them back at last, crediting their god and a violent storm in the mountains with the rescue. The shock of it rang across the Mediterranean. The barbarians of the north had reached for the holy centre of Greece itself. Some of those wanderers never turned back. They crossed into Asia Minor, the land we now call Turkey, and there, in the heart of that ancient land, carved out a territory and settled down. They became known as the Galatians, Gauls, living far from Gaul, keeping their Celtic tongue alive for centuries among the kingdoms of the East. If that name stirs a faint memory, it should. They gave their name to the region, addressed in a famous letter that much of the world still reads today. Gauls, echoing in the pages of the Bible. That is how far this restless people reached. Their reputation as fighters became a thing that could be bought and sold. Across the ancient world, kings and cities hired Celtic and Gaulish warriors as mercenaries, prizing their fury, sending them into battle from Egypt to Sicily. The Gaul for hire was a familiar figure in the armies of the age, tall and frightening and effective. The greatest of the clashes in Italy came around the year 225 BC, at a place called Telamon. A huge Gaulish host had come down once again to threaten Rome. And there, it was trapped between two Roman armies, one before it and one behind. The Greek historian Polybius left a description that has never quite faded. He told of the terrible noise the Gauls made before the fighting, the blare of countless war horns and the roar of massed men. He told of warriors in the front ranks who stripped off their clothing and stood all but naked, wearing only their weapons and the gold at their throats. Gleaming and unafraid in the morning light, they fought with everything they had, and they were destroyed. Telamon was a slaughter, and it marked the moment the long fear began, slowly, to harden into the long mastery. Rome had found its answer to the terror, and the answer was discipline, patience, and overwhelming force. The fear did not leave the Romans easily, though, and now and then it drove them to things that sit strangely against their later scorn for Gaulish savagery. More than once, in their darkest moments of dread, the Romans turned to human sacrifice of their own, guided by a grim prophecy. According to the Roman writers themselves, they took 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks, a man and a woman of each, and buried them alive beneath the city as an offering to turn the danger aside. Remember that when Rome later recoils in horror at the altars of Gaul, the people who would one day condemn the Gauls for shedding blood before their gods had, in their own fear, buried living Gauls in the earth to save themselves. When Rome faced the gravest danger in all its history, when Hannibal of Carthage brought his army over the Alps to make war on Italy, many of the Gauls of the north rose up and joined him, marching against the old enemy with open arms. Gauls fought in the ranks that dealt Rome some of the bloodiest defeats it ever suffered. To a Roman, this only cut the lesson deeper. The Gaul was not merely frightening. The Gaul was the enemy who turned up, again and again, on the very worst day of your life. Rome learned, though, and Rome endured, and Rome was patient in a way few powers in history have ever been. Over the generations that followed, the tide slowly turned. Rome beat the Gauls of northern Italy in battle after battle, broke their power, and swallowed their lands piece by piece, until the Gaulish country south of the Alps became simply another part of the Roman state. Then Rome reached across the mountains. In the decades before Caesar, it seized a broad stretch of southern Gaul along the Mediterranean coast and made it a province, a Roman foothold pressed right up against the still free peoples of the interior. By the time Caesar stepped onto the scene, the map had quietly changed. The Gauls were no longer only a terror out of the past. They were neighbours now, with Roman territory wrapped along their southern edge, and an old score still waiting, deep in the Roman heart, to be settled. All that was missing was a man with the ambition to settle it, and the cold genius to turn 300 years of fear into the greatest opportunity of his life. That man was already on his way north, and his name was Caesar. Chapter 8. Rome at the door. We have seen the Gauls as they lived. Now we must turn to the man who would end that life, and to the machine he commanded. Because to understand the war, we have to understand what Caesar needed from it. In the year 59 BC, the year before he marched north, Caesar was a man in a difficult and dangerous place. He was past 40, of an old and noble family, and by the measure of his own towering ambition, he had so far achieved far too little. Worse, he was crushed by debt. He had borrowed and spent on a scale that staggered even Rome, pouring money into the games and gifts and grand gestures that bought a Roman politician his following. The debts had come due. Had his career stalled, his creditors would have ruined him. Caesar's answer was to reach higher still. In that year, he won the consulship, the highest office in the Roman state, held by 2 men for a single year. He did not climb there alone. He bound himself to two of the most powerful men in Rome in a private alliance modern historians call the First Triumvirate. The rule of three men. One was Pompey, the most celebrated general of the age, garlanded with victories in the east. The other was Crassus, said to be the richest man in Rome, whose money had more than once kept Caesar afloat. Between them, these three carved up the Roman state for their own ends, and the bargain held just long enough to change the course of history. What Caesar wanted out of it was simple. He wanted a command. He wanted an army, and a war to use it on, far enough from Rome that he could fight it his own way, and rich enough to clear his debts and crown him with glory. Through the deal with his partners, he got it. When his year as consul ended, he was granted the governorship of the Roman provinces along the northern frontier, in northern Italy and southern Gaul, for an unusually long stretch of years. With legions under his command, he was given, in other words, a door that opened straight onto the still free peoples of Gaul. All he needed was a reason to walk through it. A Roman commander did not, in those days, simply invade a foreign country for the sport of it. He needed a justification, some threat to Rome or to Rome's friends that made war look like defense. The beauty of the frontier was that a reason could nearly always be found, and if it could not be found, it could be arranged. Caesar would prove a master at this, presenting each new conquest as a response to some danger he had no choice but to meet. The first such danger was already taking shape, far to the east, among a people penned in by the mountains and hungry for room to live. Before we follow him through that door, we should look hard at the thing he was bringing with him, because it is the key to everything that follows. Caesar commanded a Roman army, and a Roman army was unlike anything the Gauls had ever had to face for long. The Gauls were brave. Few peoples in history have been braver. Man against man, a Gaulish warrior was the equal of any Roman, often the larger and the stronger of the two. But the Gauls fought as warriors, and the Romans fought as a machine. That is all of it, in a single sentence. A Gaulish army was a gathering of fighting men, magnificent in the charge, bound together by the noble each man followed, and by the courage each meant to show. A Roman legion was something colder and more terrible. It was drilled, day after day, year after year, until obedience and maneuver were second nature. It moved as one body. On command, it could form a line, wheel, open lanes, close them, advance and fall back, all on a shouted order, while the noise and the terror of battle broke over it. Roman soldiers were professionals, in for the long term. Hardened by training, the Gauls had no equal of. They were also engineers. A Roman army on the march built a fortified camp at the end of every single day, ditch and rampart and palisade, and tore it down again at dawn. They could throw a bridge across a river, raise siege towers, drive tunnels and ramps and walls, with a patience and skill that could make the strongest Gaulish stronghold a death trap given time. This was the deep mismatch at the heart of the war that followed. Not courage against cowardice, for the courage was all on both sides. It was a furious gathering of free warriors against a tireless, disciplined, professional machine. Time and again, the Gauls would fight with a valor that wins the admiration of anyone who reads of it. And time and again, that valor would break against drill and engineering and the cold patience of Rome. At the head of that machine stood one of the most gifted commanders who ever lived. We are reading his propaganda, and we should never forget it. But the military genius behind it was painfully real. Caesar was quick, decisive, and astonishingly bold. He could march his legions at a speed that left his enemies reeling. appearing where he could not possibly be, days before he was expected. He could read a battlefield in a glance. He could feel the mood of his men and lift them, by his presence and his words, out of fear and into the fight. He shared their hardships, knew his centurions by name, and led from the front when the moment demanded it. To his soldiers he was not a distant aristocrat. He was their general, their luck, their Caesar, and they would follow him to the ends of the earth. And very nearly did. The pieces were now on the board. A divided Gaul of proud and separate peoples, brave and quarrelsome and unprepared, a frontier where a reason for war was always within reach, a professional army of brutal effectiveness, and a commander of rare brilliance and limitless ambition, in desperate need of a decisive victory to save himself and make his name. Everything was ready. All that remained was the spark. And in the spring of 58 BC, a people gave it to him by deciding, for reasons of their own, to leave their homeland and find a new one. Chapter 9. The war begins. The people who gave Caesar his war were the Helvetii, who lived in the high country that is now Switzerland, hemmed in on every side by mountains and by stronger neighbours, feeling crowded, and perhaps pressed by the warlike peoples to their north. They made a fateful decision. They would burn their own towns and villages behind them, so there could be no turning back, and migrate west across Gaul to find better and more open land. By Caesar's account, they were not a war band, but a people on the move. Men, women, and children, with their wagons and their herds and their winter stores. Their road would have taken them near the Roman province in the south, and that was all the reason Caesar required. He would later write that he found, in the captured Helvetian camp, tablets recording their numbers, and that the figure came to 368,000 souls in all, of whom some 92,000 were fighting men. We should hold those numbers at arm's length. They are Caesar's, written to impress, with no one able to check them. And ancient armies and migrations were almost always reported far larger than they truly were. What is not in doubt is that vast numbers of people were on the move, and that Caesar meant to stop them. Stop them he did, and the manner of it announced the war to come. He caught a large part of the Helvetii as they were crossing a river, one portion divided from the rest, and cut them down. He pursued the main body and brought it to battle, and after a long and hard fight, the migration broke. Caesar then ordered the survivors to turn around and march back to the ruined homeland they had burned, to rebuild and resettle it, so the empty land would not draw worse peoples in behind them. By his own telling, of the hundreds of thousands who had set out, only a small fraction ever saw home again. Whatever the true numbers, a people had tried to move, and Caesar had shattered them, and the war was one battle old. He did not stop to rest. His eye had already moved to a second danger, and this one wore a different face. While the Gauls of the centre quarrelled among themselves, some of them had made a mistake that peoples have made all through history. In a struggle against a rival, they had invited in a powerful outsider to help them, a Germanic king named Ariovistus from across the Rhine. Once invited, he had stayed and brought more of his people over the river and settled them on Gaulish land, and grown from an ally into a master. Now some of the Gauls who had once called him in were desperate to be rid of him, and they appealed to Caesar. Here was a gift. Caesar could pose as the protector of the Gauls against the German, while doing exactly what served him, which was to plant a Roman army deep in the heart of Gaul and remove a rival for its mastery. He demanded that Ariovistus stop bringing Germans across the Rhine. The king replied, in effect, that he had won his lands by the same right of the sword that Rome used, and that what Caesar did on his side of Gaul was no business of a German king, and what a German king did on his was none of Caesar's. It was a fair point, and it meant war. Before that war, something happened in Caesar's own camp that he chose, revealingly, to record. His soldiers grew afraid. Reports of the size and ferocity of the Germans, of their towering stature and their fury in battle, spread through the Roman ranks, and a real panic set in. Officers begged leave to go. Men wrote their wills. Some openly wept. This was the only time in the war that Caesar admits his army nearly came apart from fear before a blow had been struck. And it tells us something true about the terror these northern peoples could still inspire. Caesar met it head on. He gathered his men and shamed them and steadied them with a speech, telling them that if no one else would follow him, he would march with the 10th Legion alone, the legion he trusted most. It worked. The fear broke. The army moved. And in the battle that followed, Caesar defeated Ariovistus and drove the survivors back across the Rhine. In a single season, he had beaten both a mass migration and a German king, and made himself, in fact, if not yet, in name, the strongest power in Gaul. That, of course, was exactly what alarmed the Gauls, who were paying attention. They had wanted Caesar to solve a problem, not to become one. As the legions settled into winter quarters on Gaulish soil, it began to dawn on people across Gaul that the Roman had not come to help and leave. He had come to stay. And so, in the second year of the war, the fighting spread north, to the fierce peoples of the Belgae, who had watched the Roman advance with growing dread and now took up arms to stop it before it reached them. The hardest blow of that northern campaign, and one of the hardest of the entire war, came from a Belgic people called the Nervii. They were known even among the Belgae for their courage and their austerity. They allowed no wine or luxury among themselves. Believing such things softened a man for war, and they meant to keep the Roman world and its corruptions out. When Caesar's army was making camp by a river called the Sambre, the Nervii sprang an ambush of stunning speed and violence, bursting from the woods and falling on the legions before the camp was ready, before many soldiers could even find their units. For a few moments, at the Sambre, Caesar came closer to total disaster than at almost any other point in Gaul. Part of his army was nearly overrun. By his own account, he snatched a shield from a soldier and pushed into the front line himself, calling out to his centurions by name, doing everything a commander could do to keep the line from collapsing. The discipline of the legions, and the arrival of troops, still on the march, slowly turned the day. The Nervii did not break and run. They stood, and fought, and died almost where they stood. The old men and the last of them fighting on over the bodies of the fallen rather than yield. Caesar, who had every reason to magnify an enemy he had beaten, wrote that the people of the Nervii were all but wiped out that day, their fighting strength annihilated. A once mighty nation reduced almost to nothing. Even granting his exaggeration, something terrible had happened by that river, and a brave people had very nearly ceased to exist. In the third year, the war turned to the Western Sea, and to a people called the Veneti, who lived on the wild Atlantic coast of what is now Brittany, and were the foremost seafarers and traders of those waters. The fighting with them ranged across the bays and estuaries of the coast. A strange war of ships, because the Veneti sailed sturdy ocean-going vessels well suited to their grey and heaving sea, and the Romans had to build a fleet and learn its waters as they went. In the end, Roman ingenuity found the answer. They fitted long hooks to poles and used them to catch and tear down the rigging of the Venetic ships, crippling them where they sat, and so won a sea battle against a far better sailor. What Caesar did after the victory is one of the moments where the mask slips and the true nature of the war shows through. The Veneti had surrendered. Caesar decided to make an example of them that the rest of Gaul would not forget. He had their council of elders put to death, and he sold the entire population into slavery. Not the warriors only. Everyone. It was a calculated act of terror, meant to teach Gaul the price of resistance, and it should sit heavily beside every line in which Caesar presents himself as a reluctant defender of the peace. This was not defense. This was conquest, and conquest of the most ruthless kind. 3 years in, the shape of the thing could no longer be denied. A divided Gaul was being picked apart, one people at a time, played off against one another, beaten in detail, terrorized into submission. The Gauls had been brave beyond question, and it had not been enough, because bravery scattered across a dozen quarreling nations is no match for one patient and united enemy. The next 2 years would carry the war to its darkest places yet, across the Rhine and across the sea, against a treachery that shocked even Rome, and into a winter of disaster and revenge that would leave whole peoples wiped from the map. The conquest was not slowing. It was only learning how cruel it could be. Chapter 10. Resistance and Reprisal. The 4th and 5th years of the war, 55 and 54 BC, show us the full range of what Caesar was: the engineer, the showman, the avenger, and at least once, by the judgment of his own countrymen, the war criminal. It began with blood and broken faith. 2 Germanic peoples, the Usipetes and the Tencteri, driven by pressures of their own, crossed the Rhine into Gaul looking for land. Much as the Helvetii had once looked for room to live, they were, again by Caesar's account, a vast host of men, women, and children. Negotiations opened. There was talk, and a truce, and envoys passing between the camps. And then, with matters still unsettled and a cavalry skirmish having flared during the supposed truce, Caesar fell upon them. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. With the leaders of the 2 peoples detained in his camp, Caesar attacked the leaderless mass of them, fighting men and families alike, and drove them in a panic against the river. Many who were not cut down were drowned trying to flee across the Rhine. Caesar wrote that the number of the enemy had been 430,000. The figure is almost certainly inflated, in the way all his enemy numbers are, but even discounted heavily, it describes the destruction of an entire people, including those who could not fight, during a truce. This one even Rome could not entirely stomach. Back in the city, Caesar's chief rival in the Senate, the stern moralist, Cato, rose and argued that for this act of treachery against people with whom Rome had a truce, Caesar ought to be handed over to the Germans, so that the guilt of breaking faith would fall on the man who had done it and not on Rome. Nothing came of it. Cato had no power to enforce such a thing, and Caesar's victories were too useful and too popular. But the proposal stands in the record forever. A Roman of high principle, naming a Roman atrocity for exactly what it was, while it was still fresh, having destroyed them. Caesar decided to send a message across the Rhine itself, to the Germans beyond, and to the audience back in Rome. He would cross the river itself, not by boat, but by bridge. His engineers built one, a heavy timber bridge thrown across the Rhine in a matter of days. By some accounts, only 10. The feat mattered more than anything he did on the far bank, where he marched about for a short time, burned some villages, frightened the locals, and then crossed back and tore the bridge down behind him. The point was never conquest. The point was to show everyone watching that the Rhine was no barrier to Rome, that Caesar could step over it whenever he pleased. It was engineering as theatre, and the theatre was aimed at Rome. The same hunger for the spectacular carried him across a different water entirely. Twice, in those 2 years. Caesar took an army across the Channel to the mysterious island of Britain, a place at the edge of the known world, half legend to the Romans, rumoured to be a refuge for the Druids and for Gauls who fought against him. Militarily, the expeditions achieved little. Storms wrecked his ships. The Britons fought from chariots, in a style the Romans found unsettling. He won some fights, took some hostages and promises, and came home both times without leaving a lasting Roman presence behind. But to cross the open ocean and set foot on Britain, a land most Romans had only half believed in, was a sensation. The news of it thrilled the city. For Caesar's purposes, the achievement was not the conquest of Britain, it was the headline. Then, in the winter after the second crossing, the war turned and bit him harder than it ever had. That year the harvest in Gaul had been poor, and Caesar had been forced to spread his legions out across a wider stretch of country than usual, quartering them among several peoples for the winter so they could be fed. It split his strength, and the Gauls saw their chance. Among the peoples of the north were the Eburones, led by a chieftain named Ambiorix, a man Caesar had treated well and believed he had bought. Ambiorix had other ideas. He fell upon the Roman camp in his territory, where some 15 cohorts wintered, the better part of a full legion, under 2 officers named Sabinus and Cotta. When the direct assault did not break them at once, Ambiorix tried words. He came to parley and told the Romans, with apparent friendliness, that a vast rising was sweeping all Gaul, that German help was crossing the Rhine, that their isolated camp was doomed, and that, out of regard for the kindness Caesar had shown him, he was offering them safe passage to escape to the nearest other Roman force. The 2 commanders argued bitterly over whether to trust him. In the end, they marched out. The worst decision they could have made. Ambiorix and his warriors were waiting in a long valley along the route, and there they destroyed the column almost to the last man. Sabinus was killed under a flag of truce. Cotta died fighting. It was the single worst defeat Caesar suffered in all his years in Gaul. An entire force wiped out by a people he had thought beaten and bribed into friendship. Ambiorix was not finished. Flushed with success, he razed the neighbouring peoples and swept on to the next Roman camp, where a legion under an officer named Quintus Cicero, brother of the great orator, found itself suddenly besieged and badly outnumbered. What followed was a desperate siege through the cold. The Gauls even copying Roman siege methods they had watched and learned, ringing the camp with a rampart, raising towers, hurling fire. Cicero's men held on, wounded and exhausted, sending messenger after messenger slipping through the enemy lines to beg Caesar for help. One message, the story goes, was tied to a spear and thrown over the wall, and lay unnoticed for 2 days before it was found. When word finally reached Caesar, he moved with the speed that was his genius, gathering what troops he could and racing to the rescue, and by a clever feint drawing the Gaulish army onto ground where his smaller force could break it. Cicero's camp was saved at the very edge of its endurance. But the spell of Roman invincibility had been broken. All Gaul had seen that the legions could be beaten, that a Roman army could be wiped from the earth. The lesson would not be forgotten. Caesar's revenge, when it came, was meant to be remembered. Ambiorix and the Eburones had humiliated him, and he set out not merely to defeat them, but to erase them from the earth. Unable to catch the elusive Ambiorix himself, who slipped away again and again and was never taken, Caesar turned his fury on the man's people. He laid their country waste, burned their settlements and their crops, and then did something colder still. He sent word to all the neighbouring peoples that the Eburones were fair game. inviting anyone who wished to come and plunder them, so that the odium of their destruction would be shared and their land picked clean by many hands. The Eburones were hunted through their own forests and marshes and very nearly annihilated as a people. Ambiorix escaped to the end, but the nation that had dealt Rome its worst defeat was effectively wiped from the map. A warning written in a people's blood for all of Gaul to read. This was the Gaul of the year 53 BC, a land where the Romans had shown they could be beaten, and where Rome had answered by showing it would destroy a whole people to make a point. Fear and fury were rising together. The conquest had bred a hatred deep enough and wide enough to do at last the one thing the Gauls had never managed in all their centuries of freedom. It was about to make them one, and the man who would forge that unity, out of all the scattered pride and grief and rage of a conquered land, was already coming of age among the Arverni. Chapter 11. The Man Who United Gaul. His name was Vercingetorix. It comes down to us through Caesar's own pages, which is its own kind of irony, that we know the greatest of Gaul's defenders, chiefly through the words of the man who destroyed him. He was a nobleman of the Arverni, that proud people of the highlands, young, and by every sign that survives, extraordinary. In the year 52 BC, with Caesar away to the south and Gaul simmering with revolt, Vercingetorix did what no Gaul had ever quite done before. He set out to unite his people, not as allies for a single campaign, but as one nation under one command, against Rome. It did not come easily. When he first called for war, the leading men of his own town threw him out. Fearing the Roman vengeance such a rising would bring, he went into the countryside, gathered the poor and the desperate and the angry, raised a force, and came back and took control. Then he reached beyond the Arverni to people after people across Gaul, by persuasion, by alliance, by the sheer pull of a cause whose time had come. One after another they joined him, until much of Gaul stood together behind a single leader for the first time in its history. They made him their war chief, and he set about welding a collection of proud and fractious nations into something that could face the legions. He was a hard and clear-eyed commander. He understood that Gaulish armies had a habit of falling apart, undone by their own quarrels and their love of the reckless charge, and he imposed a discipline they were not used to, demanding hostages from the peoples who joined him, punishing waverers with a severity meant to hold the alliance together by fear as much as by hope. More important still, he understood Caesar's deepest weakness and built his whole strategy upon it. That weakness was food. A Roman army was a magnificent machine, but it was a hungry one, and it could not carry all it needed. It had to draw supplies from the land around it as it moved. Take away the food, Vercingetorix reasoned, and the machine would starve. So he settled on a strategy that asked an almost unbearable sacrifice of his own people. They would not meet the legions in the open field, where Roman discipline would grind them down. They would burn their own country instead. They would lay waste the land in Caesar's path, torch the farms and the grain stores, drive off the cattle, and even put their own towns to the flame, so that the Romans would march through a blackened wasteland with nothing to eat. It was scorched earth, the same terrible logic the Helvetii had once used on themselves, now turned into a weapon of national defense. It nearly worked, and the cost of it tells you how close it came. Town after town went up in flames at Vercingetorix's order, the people watching their own homes burn for the sake of the larger fight. Then they came to Avaricum, the chief town of the Bituriges, the most beautiful of all their towns by Caesar's own account. Ringed by river and marsh and strong walls, the Bituriges could not bear to burn it. They begged Vercingetorix to spare it, swearing they could defend it, Against his better judgment, he relented, and that mercy became a trap. Caesar, his army half-starved and desperate, fell upon Avaricum with all the fury of hunger behind him. The Gauls inside fought brilliantly and defended with real ingenuity, countering every Roman device, undermining the siege works, raising their walls as fast as the Romans threatened them, holding out through cold and rain. But Caesar's engineers were relentless, and at last, in a downpour, the Romans stormed over the walls. What happened next was not war, but massacre. The legions, starved and savage with resentment, killed nearly everyone inside, sparing neither age nor sex. Caesar reports that of some 40,000 people in Avaricum, only a few hundred escaped to reach Vercingetorix. The number, like all his numbers, may be loose, but the meaning is not. A beautiful town had been taken and its people slaughtered, and the Roman army had fed itself on the stores it captured there. Vercingetorix had warned them. The mercy he allowed had cost his people one of the worst days of the war. Avaricum, however, did not break the revolt. If anything, it hardened it. And within weeks, Vercingetorix handed Caesar the sharpest defeat of his entire war. It came at Gergovia, the chief stronghold of Vercingetorix's own Arverni, a town set high on a steep plateau, exceedingly difficult to attack. Caesar laid siege to it, but the position was formidable, and Vercingetorix held the heights with skill. Worse for Caesar, his oldest and most important allies in Gaul, the Aedui, the people Rome had long called brothers, were beginning to waver and turn against him, drawn at last toward their countryman's cause. With his alliance cracking beneath him and the siege stalled, Caesar attempted to seize part of the heights by a sudden assault. It went wrong. His soldiers, carried away or misreading their orders, pushed too far up the slope and were caught and thrown back by the Gauls in disorder. The repulse cost him dearly. By his own admission, many hundreds of men, including a painful number of his veteran centurions. Caesar broke off the siege of Gergovia and withdrew. It was, plainly and undeniably, a defeat, and he was honest enough to record it, dressing it as best he could, but not denying it. The great Caesar had been beaten in open battle, before all of Gaul, by Vercingetorix. The effect was electric. The news of Gergovia ran across Gaul like fire. And now, the Aedui, those long faithful friends of Rome, broke with Caesar openly and threw in their lot with the revolt. With them went their wealth, their warriors, and their prestige, and the rising swelled into something close to a war of all Gaul against Rome. Vercingetorix was confirmed as the leader of nearly the whole country. For one shining and dangerous moment, it looked as though the impossible had happened, as though a united Gaul might actually drive Caesar out. The dream the Gauls had never dared to dream was suddenly, vividly alive. It did not last, because Caesar was at his most dangerous when cornered, and because Vercingetorix now made the one mistake his strategy could not afford. As Caesar regrouped and the two sides maneuvered, Vercingetorix had a chance to keep playing the patient game, to keep starving and harrying and never giving the legions the open battle they craved. Instead, at a moment when his cavalry attacked the Roman column and was beaten back, things tipped. Vercingetorix pulled his army into a fortified hilltop town to regroup and wait for the rest of Gaul to gather to him, expecting Caesar to be unable to touch him there. The town was called Alesia. It sat high on a hill, ringed by rivers and valleys, a natural fortress, the kind of place a Gaulish leader could feel safe. It was the worst move he could have made, because he had just handed Caesar the one thing the Roman did best, a siege. He had taken the war out of the open country, where Rome could be starved and bled, and locked it inside a single fixed place, where Roman engineering reigned supreme. Vercingetorix had gathered the hope of Gaul onto one hilltop. Caesar was coming to build a wall around it. What happened next at Alesia would decide the fate of Gaul, and it remains one of the most extraordinary feats of war in all of history. Chapter 12. Alesia. Stand for a moment with the Roman army at the foot of the hill of Alesia, in the late summer of 52 BC, and look at the problem Caesar faced, because the scale of his answer is hard to believe even now. On the hilltop sat Vercingetorix with a powerful army, too strong to storm directly. Caesar could not take Alesia by assault, so he resolved to take it by hunger, to wall the entire hill in and starve the Gauls into surrender. His soldiers began to build, around the hill of Alesia, mile upon mile. They raised a continuous line of fortification, a wall and ditches and towers facing inward at the town, sealing Vercingetorix and his host inside with no way out. This was the inner ring, and it ran for something like 10 miles around the hill. Caesar, though, knew what Vercingetorix was waiting for. He knew a vast Gaulish army was gathering across the country to come and relieve the siege, and that when it came, his own besieging force would be caught between the defenders on the hill and the relievers at his back. So he did the thing that has stunned soldiers and historians ever since. He built a second wall, facing outward this time, away from the town, ringing his entire army in a second continuous line of fortification, longer than the first, to hold off the relief force when it arrived. His men now stood between two walls of their own making, ready to fight in both directions at once, inward against Vercingetorix and outward against all the rest of Gaul. Between and before these walls, Caesar's engineers sowed a nightmare, lines of sharpened stakes, pits with fire-hardened points hidden at the bottom, set in rows and covered over, iron hooks and spurs buried in the ground. A killing field, laid out with cold method, to break any charge before it reached the ramparts. The vast double ring, with all its traps and towers, was thrown up in a matter of weeks, while the enemy watched from the hill. It was one of the supreme displays of what a Roman army could do with a shovel and a plan, and it would prove deadlier than any sword. Inside Alesia, the trap closed, slowly and cruelly, as Caesar had meant it to. Vercingetorix had gathered a large host onto that hill, but he had not gathered enough food to feed them for a long siege. And the people of the town itself, the Mandubii whose home Alesia was, were there too. The families, the old, the women and the children. As the days stretched on and the grain ran low, Vercingetorix faced a decision of unbearable cruelty. To make his fighting men and his stores last until the relief came, he put the townspeople out. He expelled the Mandubii, the non-combatants, the very people whose town it was, sending them down the hill to beg their way through the Roman lines, so that fewer mouths would eat the dwindling food inside. Caesar refused to let them pass. He would not open his wall to them. He would not take them in, nor let them through to safety, nor feed them. He left them where they were, in the bare ground between the hilltop and the Roman wall, in the no-man's land between the two armies. They could not go back, for Alesia had cast them out. They could not go forward, for Rome would not receive them. And so they stayed there, in that narrow strip of earth, and they starved, men, women, and children, caught between their own people and the enemy, dying slowly of hunger in full view of both. Caesar records it without a flicker of remorse. It was, to him, simply the correct decision. a way to press harder on the food inside the town and weaken the enemy. It is one of the coldest passages in the book, and one of the most revealing. This is what the conquest of Gaul looked like, stripped of every fine word. A field of starving children between two walls. Hold that image. Whatever else is said of Alesia, of its genius and its drama, that is its true heart. The fate of the Mandubi is the price of empire, written plainly, for anyone willing to read it. Then the relief came. Across Gaul, the call had gone out, and a huge army had answered. Peoples from every corner of the land, marching to break the siege and free Vercingetorix and finish Caesar at last. Caesar puts its numbers in the hundreds of thousands. 250,000 men and more. And though the figure is surely swollen in the telling, there is no doubt that an enormous force arrived behind him. More than enough, it seemed, to crush his army against the walls of Alesia. Now the full madness of his double wall revealed its purpose. The Romans were outnumbered, perhaps badly, and surrounded. The defenders of Alesia before them, and the great relief host behind, and they had to hold both lines at once, or die. What followed was several days of some of the most desperate fighting of the ancient world. The relief army hurled itself at the outer wall, while Vercingetorix and his men attacked the inner one. The two Gaulish forces straining to crush the Romans between them. The legions running from one front to the other to plug each breach. By night and by day, the assaults came on. The Gauls found a weak point where the Roman lines could not be fully closed, a place where the ground had forced a gap, and threw their strongest effort against it, and very nearly broke through. The crisis came at that gap. The Roman line bent and began to give way, and for a few moments, the whole siege, the whole war, the whole fate of Gaul, hung on a few hundred yards of failing rampart. And then Caesar came. He had kept reserves in hand for exactly this, and now he led them to the breaking point himself. His scarlet commander's cloak deliberately visible, so his struggling men would see that their general had come, that Caesar was here, in the worst of it. With them, the sight of him, and the fresh troops, and a charge of cavalry he had sent secretly around to strike the relief army from behind, turned the moment. The Gaulish assault faltered, then broke. The vast relief army, so close to victory, suddenly shattered and fled, streaming away from Alesia in defeat. And on the hilltop, Vercingetorix watched the last hope of Gaul scatter and vanish into the distance. It was over. He had gambled everything on this, and he had lost. The next day, Vercingetorix gathered the leaders of the Gauls who were with him and told them the truth. The fight was finished. He offered to let them do with him as they wished, to kill him and send his body to the Romans, or to hand him over alive. Whatever might win the others the best terms, they chose to give him up. And so came one of the most haunting scenes in all of ancient history, the surrender of the man who had united Gaul. Caesar, in his own account, describes it briefly and coldly. Vercingetorix was handed over. The weapons were thrown down. The leaders were delivered up. Later Roman writers, telling the story afterward, gave it the grandeur they felt it deserved. In their telling, Vercingetorix put on his finest armour, mounted his best horse, and rode out alone from the gates of Alesia. He rode once around the seated figure of Caesar, in silence. Then he dismounted, took off his arms, and laid them down, and sat at the conqueror's feet without a word, and waited. Whether it happened exactly so, we cannot know, but something in that image has never let the world go. The proud young chieftain who had so nearly won, laying his sword at the feet of the man who had broken his country, and saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Alesia was the end. there would be scattered resistance still. A last few embers to be stamped out over the following year. But the heart had gone out of the rebellion the moment that relief army broke. Free Gaul, the Gaul of the Druids and the Oppida and the proud, separate nations. The Gaul that had terrified Rome for 300 years. Died on that hill in the autumn of 52 BC. What came after was no longer a war. It was an accounting, and the bill, when Rome added it up, was almost beyond imagining. Chapter 13. 1,000,000 Ghosts. How many people died in Caesar's conquest of Gaul? The honest answer is that we do not know, and cannot. But the ancient figures, even treated with all the caution they demand, describe one of the deadliest events of the ancient world. The Greek writer Plutarch, writing more than a century later in his Life of Caesar, summed up the campaign in numbers that have echoed ever since. He wrote that Caesar had stormed more than 800 towns, subdued 300 peoples, and fought against 3 million men, of whom 1 million had been killed in the fighting and another million taken captive. We must handle those numbers with real care. Plutarch was not counting bodies. He was working from earlier sources, perhaps from Caesar's own boasts. And ancient writers reached for round and enormous figures, the way we reach for a word like countless. 1,000,000 dead and 1,000,000 enslaved may be far too high. And yet, even if the truth were only a fraction of it, even a quarter, we are still looking at a catastrophe almost without parallel in that age. The death or enslavement of a huge portion of an entire population. The emptying of whole regions. A free country reduced in a single decade to a Roman province built on graves. Enslavement was the other face of it, as terrible in its way as death. War in the ancient world ran on slaves, and a conquest on this scale flooded the slave markets of the Mediterranean with human beings. Every town stormed, every people beaten, every camp overrun, produced its long lines of the captured. Men and women and children roped together and marched south to be sold. Caesar himself, the records suggest, on a single occasion sold tens of thousands of captives in one stroke. Behind Plutarch's cold figure of 1,000,000 enslaved lies an ocean of individual ruin. Each one a person with a name and a home and a family, dragged out of a free life and into a foreign bondage from which almost none would ever return. The wealth of it, the sheer profit of selling a conquered people, helped make Caesar one of the richest men in Rome, and paid the debts that had driven him north in the first place. Gaul did not only fall to Caesar, Gaul paid for Caesar. What of the man who had tried to stop it? The one leader who had made Rome tremble at the very end. His fate was the cruelest of all. In its slow and deliberate way, Vercingetorix was not killed at Alesia. He was kept. He was taken to Rome a prisoner and held there, in confinement, for some 5 years, alive but caged, waiting, though he did not yet know for what. He was being saved. In the year 46 BC, when Caesar at last celebrated his triumphs in Rome, the spectacular victory parades through the heart of the city. Vercingetorix was brought out for the occasion. After 5 years in a cell, the proud chieftain of the Arverni was paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. A trophy, the captured leader of Gaul put on show for the jeering crowds as the centerpiece of Caesar's Gaulish triumph. And when the parade was over, when he had served his purpose as a spectacle, he was taken away to the prison beneath the Capitol, and there, in the dark, quietly strangled. That was the end of Vercingetorix. No battlefield, no glory, only a cell, a parade, and an executioner in a cold stone room. Rome had kept him alive for years for the sole purpose of killing him on the right day. in front of the right crowd. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it tells you what the war had really been about. Not safety, not defense against a threat. It had been about Caesar, his glory, his career, his immortal name, and Vercingetorix, who had given everything for the freedom of his people, ended as a prop in another man's pageant, strangled when the applause died down. As for Caesar, he got everything he had wanted, and it destroyed him, and it destroyed the thing he had served. The conquest of Gaul made him the richest and most powerful man in Rome, with the most loyal and battle-hardened army in the world at his back. But his rivals in the Senate feared exactly that, and when they tried to strip him of his command, the result was civil war. Roman against Roman. Caesar against his old partner Pompey. Caesar won that war too. He made himself dictator, master of the Roman state, the most powerful Roman who had ever lived. He had climbed all the way to the top. There, at the very summit, on a day in March in the year 44 BC, a group of senators who believed he had become a king in all but name surrounded him in the Senate house and stabbed him to death. The author of the commentaries, the conqueror of Gaul, fell bleeding at the foot of a statue, killed by his own countrymen. The war that had drowned Gaul in blood had also, in the end, helped drown the Roman Republic itself. For out of the chaos that followed Caesar's murder came not the old free Rome the assassins had dreamed of saving, but the rule of emperors. Caesar's own heir would become the first of them. That heir, Augustus, would inherit Gaul along with everything else. And it was he, not Caesar, who truly set about turning the conquered land into a working part of the empire, organizing it, taxing it, drawing its borders, settling it into the long Roman peace. The killing was over, the province was made, and on the surface, it seemed that Rome had won completely, that Gaul had been beaten, enslaved, reorganized, and absorbed, that the proud free country was simply gone, erased, finished. But it was not finished, because here is the strange and final turn of the story. Rome conquered Gaul, and then, across the long centuries that followed, Gaul reached up out of the grave and changed Rome, and outlived it, and became something neither Caesar nor Vercingetorix could ever have imagined. Chapter 14. What Rome could not erase. On the surface, Rome won, and won completely. Within a few generations of Alesia, Gaul was thoroughly Roman. Roman roads ran across it. Roman towns rose, with forums and baths and amphitheatres. The Gaulish nobles, who had once ridden to war behind Vercingetorix, now wore the toga, spoke Latin, sent their sons to Roman schools, and competed for Roman honours. The land that Caesar had drowned in blood became one of the wealthiest and most peaceful parts of the empire. So settled, so prosperous, so Roman, that it could be hard to remember it had ever been anything else. And yet, look a little closer at that Roman Gaul, and you find that the Gauls had not so much vanished as gone quiet, and woven themselves into the thing that had conquered them. Their gods did not die. They put on Roman names and Roman faces and lived on, worshipped at Roman-looking shrines, under titles that paired a Roman god with an old Gaulish one. The goddess of horses the Gauls had loved was taken up by the Roman cavalry and carried across the empire. Sacred springs that had been holy to the Gauls before Caesar stayed holy, with Roman temples raised above the same old waters. Beneath the Roman surface, the older devotion went on, changed but not erased. Their blood and their gifts flowed into the new order too, those Gaulish skills we spoke of, in metal and cloth and craft, made Roman Gaul a workshop of the empire. Gaulish riders filled the Roman cavalry. In time, Gauls did not merely serve Rome. They became Rome. They became citizens, officials, senators, generals. Within a few centuries, men of Gaulish descent would sit at the highest tables of the empire, and the line between Gaul and Roman would blur until it all but disappeared. There is a single moment that captures this turn better than any other, and it is worth telling in full. The Romans had founded a city in the heart of Gaul, where two rivers meet, and called it Lugdunum. We call it Lion today. It grew into the chief city of the Roman Gauls, a proud capital of the provinces, and it happened to be the birthplace of a future Roman emperor named Claudius. In the year 48 AD, the Emperor Claudius stood before the Roman Senate and argued for something startling. He proposed that the leading men of Gaul, the descendants of the peoples Caesar had conquered less than 100 years before, should be allowed to enter the Senate of Rome itself, to sit among the rulers of the empire. There was resistance. To many old Roman families, it was unthinkable that the grandsons of Gaulish chieftains should help govern the Roman state. But Claudius made his case, reaching back into history to argue that Rome had always grown strong by absorbing the peoples it defeated, by making former enemies into citizens, rather than holding them forever at arm's length as the conquered. He won the argument, and the most remarkable thing is that we can still read his words. The speech was carved onto a bronze tablet and set up in Lugdunum, in Gaul, and a large part of that tablet has survived 2,000 years and can be seen to this day. So we have it, in bronze, from the mouth of an emperor born on Gaulish soil, less than a century after Caesar slaughtered them by the hundreds of thousands, after Vercingetorix was strangled in his cell. The sons of the conquered were being welcomed into the very heart of Roman power. The people Rome had crushed were becoming the people who ran it. Not everything survived, though. One thing was truly lost, and its loss is the great silence at the center of this whole story. The Druids, and the knowledge they carried, did not make the journey into Roman Gaul. Rome had feared them from the start, as the keepers of a national identity and a power that answered to no emperor, and the Roman authorities moved against them, forbidding their practices, hunting their gatherings out of public life, stripped of their sacred role, denied the open standing they had once held. The order withered, and because they had chosen, across all those centuries, never to write their teaching down, when the chain of living memory was finally broken, the knowledge simply went out, like a fire with no one left to feed it. 20 years of learning, held mind to mind, generation after generation. The law, the astronomy, the poetry, the names and natures of the gods, the inner life of a civilization. When the last teachers fell silent and no students came after them, it was gone, not burned, not buried, just ended, faded out of the world with the men who had carried it. We are left with the outside of it. A few names, a few fragments, the reports of strangers, and an outline where a great body of wisdom used to be. Of all that Rome took from Gaul, this was the one loss that could never be undone. Their wisdom went into the ground with them, and the ground has never given it back. And yet, even in defeat, even across 2,000 years, the Gauls refused to disappear completely. Their language faded, slowly, over the centuries, as Latin took its place. But it did not vanish without a trace. It left its mark on the Latin spoken in Gaul, in words, in sounds, in place names that still dot the map. And that Latin, shaped on Gaulish ground and in Gaulish mouths, grew and changed over the centuries into the language we now call French. The tongue of Vercingetorix is gone, but it is not wholly absent from the language France speaks today. Something stranger still happened to the memory of the Gauls themselves. The descendants of Roman Gaul became the French, and the French, looking back across the centuries for their own beginnings, did not choose Rome. They chose the Gauls. Generations of French schoolchildren have been taught a famous phrase that begins, "Our ancestors, the Gauls, the people Caesar conquered, became, in the national imagination, the founding ancestors of a proud modern nation, claimed with pride." And Vercingetorix, the young chieftain strangled in a Roman cell, rose again. In the 1860s, a French emperor, Napoleon III, who was fascinated by Caesar and by the Gallic War, had a colossal statue of Vercingetorix raised on the site of Alesia, where the last hope of free Gaul had died. There the defeated rebel stands, to this day, cast in metal, gazing out over the field of his ruin. No longer a Roman trophy, but a national hero, the first great defender of the homeland. The man Rome killed to erase had become, across the centuries, a symbol that would never be erased. He lives on in lighter ways too. To this day, some of the best loved stories in France, read and laughed over by millions of children and grown-ups around the world, follow a tiny village of irrepressible Gauls who hold out, cleverly and comically, against the Roman legions that surround them, refusing to the last to be conquered. The history was a tragedy. The memory, somehow, turned into something a country could smile about and be proud of. That, too, is a kind of victory, and one Caesar never saw coming. That, then, is the story of the Gauls, the people Caesar conquered and Rome never quite managed to forget. We began with a book, written by lamplight in a tent at the edge of a country its author was busy destroying. A book so well made that for 2,000 years it nearly drowned out every other voice. Tonight we have tried to listen past it, to the people on the far side of the page, the makers of iron and gold, the keepers of a wisdom too vast to write down, the worshippers in the quiet groves, the brave and quarrelsome nations who could never quite unite until it was too late, and the one young man who very nearly united them in the end, the starving children between the walls, the ghosts, the million ghosts, whose number we will never truly know. They were not savages waiting for Rome to save them. They were a people, as real and as human as any other, with their own genius and their own cruelty, their own laws and gods and songs, going about their lives in a green and ancient land, with no idea of the storm that was coming for them out of the south. They lost. History is full of peoples who lost, but they were here, and they mattered, and tonight, for a few hours, they were remembered. The fire has burned low now. The legions have marched off into the dark of 2,000 years ago, and the old gods have gone quiet in their groves, and the long argument between Caesar and the people he conquered has faded to a whisper. There is nothing left to do but rest. So let your breath go slow, and let the lamplight dim, and let the green hills of Gaul fade gently into sleep. The book is closed, the Roman voice is still, and on the far side of the page, at last, all is quiet, and all is peaceful, and all is well. Sleep now. Rest easy. We will keep the old stories safe until you wake.